The drive through the quiet streets of Houston felt heavier than it should have. I gripped the wheel, eyes flicking from the rearview mirror to the string of luxury cars parked along the driveway of the sprawling home ahead. Every detail, from the twinkling lights to the meticulous floral arrangements, screamed opulence. I had paid for all of this, yet as I sat in my own car, I felt invisible, a ghost in the life I had built. My heart tightened with a familiar mix of anticipation and frustration, a quiet resentment simmering just below the surface. All these years I had poured myself into supporting her ambitions, funding gatherings, shaping appearances, and still, I often felt like nothing more than an afterthought. Tonight should have been different, a moment to finally witness acknowledgement, but intuition whispered caution. Pulling up the driveway, I noticed the details I had arranged, the customized champagne flutes, the subtle decorations that reflected my touch. Yet no one seemed to notice. Names called in laughter passed me by. My contributions were quietly absorbed into the background. My chest tightened as I observed colleagues and family alike, caught up in the social currents of the gathering, completely unaware of my presence. Each misplaced glass, every overlooked acknowledgement, was a reminder of the recurring invisibility I had endured. I felt my frustration swelling beneath the calm exterior I forced upon myself. I reminded myself to remain composed, to watch and learn, to observe without giving away the storm building inside. Then I saw her, my wife, across the room, laughing at some private joke with another guest. The warmth in her eyes, the intimacy of her gestures, it was unmistakable. My stomach lurched. Shock and disbelief collided with the bitter taste of recognition. She was not just ignoring me, she was deliberately elevating someone else in front of our friends, in front of everyone. Micro-expressions flickered across the faces of those around us, subtle hints of the tension I had yet to fully understand. My pulse quickened, a slow burn of anger and disbelief settling into my bones. I knew, even in this first glimpse, that something public, something deeply personal, was about to unfold. I stayed still, resisting the urge to confront her prematurely, holding my fury in check as my mind raced. The moment escalated as she retrieved a microphone from the podium, preparing to make a public declaration. I watched, caught between helplessness and indignation. Memories of past sacrifices flashed unbidden. Every time I had stayed silent, every unnoticed effort, every unacknowledged contribution. I realized the stakes were higher than I had anticipated. Pride, reputation, personal history, all intertwined with the display she was about to orchestrate. Humiliation and anger surged simultaneously, a tight knot in my chest that refused to loosen. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to observe, to catalog every gesture, every expression. I knew that how I chose to respond or not respond would define the unfolding narrative, my presence, my worth, and perhaps my dignity. In the midst of the tension, I recalled countless moments of being overlooked, birthdays forgotten, opinions dismissed, achievements unnoticed. A quiet debate unfolded in my mind. Should I act immediately or wait, gather information, prepare for a precise response? I mapped out subtle strategies, ways to expose the inequity without yielding to rash emotion. Intelligence, patience, and observation became my allies. I resolved to hold back outward expression, to maintain composure, to let the situation reveal itself fully before intervening. Each pause, each careful assessment sharpened my resolve. A sense of cautious optimism mingled with simmering tension. I would not be a passive participant tonight. Then she raised the microphone. Time seemed to slow as I noted the slight tremor in her hand, the delicate sway of her smile, the collective attention of the guests turning toward her. Anticipation and controlled fury coiled tightly within me. I clenched my fists lightly, heart hammering, every instinct screaming that a confrontation was imminent. The room, filled with light chatter and clinking glasses, became a stage for the revelation I had dreaded and expected in equal measure. I watched, calculating, waiting for the moment that would either confirm my suspicions or shatter the fragile calm I had maintained. The energy in the air was electric, heavy with unspoken possibilities and the promise of a betrayal laid bare. Stepping into the grand party hall, I was immediately struck by the contrast between the opulence surrounding me and the invisible thread I felt tying me to the background. The chandeliers reflected 100 tiny lights across crystal vases and polished surfaces, each meticulously placed Yet my eyes caught the subtle gestures my wife directed towards certain guests, an extra laugh here, a lingering touch there. I reminded myself to take a breath, to not let the irritation show, even as it tugged at the edges of my patience. Every ounce of effort I had poured into organizing, funding, and supporting this evening felt swallowed by the hum of conversation and the polished smiles that passed me by. My hands rested lightly at my sides as I moved through the crowd, eyes scanning faces, cataloging every slight and every unnoticed detail, each moment sharpening my awareness. As I navigated through clusters of guests, the social dynamics unfolded with precision. Colleagues offered polite praises to my wife, commenting on the decor and the evening's seamless flow, while my presence barely registered. A whisper here, a fleeting glance there, micro-expressions revealing who held sway and who merely followed along. My contributions, from the curated playlist to the subtle floral arrangements I had suggested, were absent from any recognition. I noticed the empty acknowledgement spaces, the overlooked corners where my efforts should have shined. Tension coiled in my chest, a mixture of curiosity and unease, compelling me to move carefully, to absorb the scene before deciding my next steps. The awareness of these hidden agendas, of subtle exclusions and social maneuvering, built a silent resolve within me, preparing me for what was coming. Then I overheard it. A private conversation between two guests, their words barely above a murmur, but loaded with intent. They discussed the party's arrangements, the credit for the night's success subtly being redirected to someone else. My chest tightened, a bitter taste of betrayal spreading slowly as I processed their implication. My mind raced, balancing anger and strategy, knowing any immediate reaction could betray my position. The contrast between public praise lavished on my wife and private acknowledgement being stolen from me crystallized the injustice. I forced myself to maintain composure, cataloging every phrase, every glance, mentally preparing for the confrontation that loomed. The frustration simmered beneath the surface, a quiet but sharp edge to my observation, reinforcing the sense of humiliation I had been quietly enduring. A small movement caught my eye. A colleague I had often overlooked gave me a meaningful glance from across the room. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet the recognition it carried was unmistakable. In that fleeting look, I sensed either a potential ally or a subtle obstacle in the unfolding drama. The ambiguity of intent kept me alert, evaluating every detail of their stance, every inflection in their voice. Could this person be trusted, or would they simply play another part in the evening's intricate performance of favoritism and hidden machinations? Caution mingled with cautious hope. As I filed this observation alongside the growing map of social currents swirling around me, each element a piece in a puzzle I had yet to fully solve. I took a moment to step back, to piece together what I had seen so far. The interplay of gestures, whispers, and hidden agendas painted a picture I could not ignore. I replayed previous instances where similar betrayals had gone unnoticed, each memory bolstering my resolve and sharpening my strategy. My mind traced the potential paths for action, weighing the benefits of restraint against the power of timely exposure. Quiet determination replaced initial shock as I acknowledged that patience and calculation would be my strongest tools in navigating tonight's revelations. I moved through the crowd with measured steps, absorbing every subtle cue, every slight shift in the atmosphere, building an inner foundation of strength. My gaze returned to my wife as she edged closer to the center of attention, the stage of the evening signaling that the moment of revelation was approaching. A small smirk curled her lips, deliberate and unnerving, as she cast a glance across the assembled guests. My heart tightened, awareness sharpening every sense. The room seemed to hush in anticipation, though no one would admit it aloud. I braced myself, holding a mixture of apprehension and controlled fury, ready to respond with deliberate precision. Every observation, every internal calculation, was now poised to meet the unfolding challenge. I steadied myself, knowing the night had only begun and that the forthcoming moments would demand both resolve and measured action. The hum of conversation in the central hall had shifted slightly since I first arrived, and with it, the pattern of subtle exclusion became undeniable. I drifted from group to group, catching fragments of laughter and whispered comments, each one carrying a twinge of derision or an inside joke I wasn't part of. Every time I tried to insert myself into a conversation, a pause, a polite nod, and the discussion slid past me as if I were air. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the recognition of a recurring pattern. the irritation of being rendered invisible despite my contributions. My mind replayed small slights, the overlooked floral arrangements, the menu choices I had suggested, the countless hours I had devoted to the seamless execution of this evening, all fading into the background while others basked in approval. I clenched my fists briefly, reminding myself that observation was as powerful as confrontation. Then it happened. I witnessed my wife offering glowing public praise to someone who had scarcely lifted a finger in the preparations, taking credit for what I had orchestrated behind the scenes. I felt my stomach knot, a mixture of humiliation and rage threatening to surface, but I held it back, maintaining a composed exterior. I reminded myself that strategic silence could be more devastating than immediate confrontation. The awareness of this calculated betrayal cut sharply, the disparity between her words and the truth burning in my mind. I could feel the simmering frustration transform into a quiet, determined focus. I would reclaim recognition, but on my terms. Each gesture and comment I observed now fueled a growing internal strategy. I began to track patterns, mentally cataloging the nuances of favoritism and exclusion that permeated the gathering. Subtle glances, shared smirks, and the way certain guests were given prime attention all spoke to the undercurrents of hierarchy that I had learned to read over the years. In response, a plan began to take shape within me, a way to assert my presence without losing control. My thoughts raced through potential approaches, timing, positioning, leveraging alliances, and observing the flow of attention to choose the precise moment to act. Calm analysis replaced initial irritation, and each calculated thought reinforced my resolve. I measured each breath, each movement through the crowd, knowing that patience would yield a stronger position when the critical moment arrived. A hushed warning floated across the room, a whisper I almost didn't catch, suggesting that someone had noticed my involvement, my fingerprints on the night's successes. My ears perked up, mind alert to the potential implications. The tension heightened immediately, a subtle hope mingled with caution. Could this warning serve my purposes, or was it a prelude to being further undermined? My pulse quickened slightly as I processed the information, calculating how to respond strategically while keeping a composed exterior. The stakes were higher now, the balance of power shifting in tiny increments, each whisper a possible lever for influence or exposure. The air thickened as subtle cues indicated that the moment of public acknowledgement or confrontation was approaching. I repositioned myself mentally and physically, stepping closer to the edge of the central floor without drawing attention. Every detail mattered: timing, proximity, the angle of my gaze, the awareness of witnesses. I felt controlled anxiety threading through me, a measured tension that sharpened focus rather than clouding judgment. My mind cycled through possible sequences, rehearsing the interplay of words, reactions, and subtle gestures that could amplify the effect of my eventual assertion. As the key figures drifted toward the central stage, my anticipation surged. The culmination of carefully observed patterns, whispered warnings, and personal indignities hung in the air. I sensed the shift, the gathering storm that would soon erupt into revelation or confrontation. My pulse aligned with the rhythm of the crowd, every nerve alert, every thought sharpened to precision. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down as I prepared to step into the space where hidden agendas and silent battles would finally collide. I steadied myself, knowing that every move, every glance, would count in the delicate orchestration of exposure and reclamation. The ballroom seemed larger now, the air thick with quiet maneuvering and the subtle currents of influence weaving between groups of guests. Every laugh, every nod, every slight glance carried layers I had learned to read over the years. My contributions, the hours spent ensuring the ambiance, the careful curation of details, were being overlooked again. Someone else received credit for the floral arrangements I had meticulously selected. Another took the spotlight for coordinating the music schedule I had meticulously organized. Each oversight, intentional or not, pressed against my patience, fueling a simmering resentment that I forced down with controlled breaths. I moved through the room with careful steps, greeting those who acknowledged me and noting the microaggressions of those who did not, cataloging every detail for strategic use later. Then a hushed remark cut across the room, whispered between two guests close to my wife. It was barely audible, a shadow of an accusation suggesting that I had some ulterior motive behind the party's execution. My heart skipped, the sting of shock mixed with indignation, but I stayed composed. My mind shifted immediately into observation mode, identifying the individuals who might pose a threat or be swayed in the unfolding dynamics. It was the type of moment where a misstep could solidify misperceptions, and I resolved to remain silent yet vigilant. Each smile I returned, each nod I offered, was now laced with intentional calculation, a quiet chess game unfolding beneath the glittering lights. The people I thought I could trust displayed ambiguous loyalties. Familiar faces gave fleeting smiles that seemed to carry hidden agendas, and I found myself reassessing past alliances, anticipating potential betrayals. Each interaction became a puzzle, each conversation a test. I measured my reactions carefully, aware that the wrong word could trigger exposure or deepen exclusion. At the same time, I sought subtle openings, small gestures or glances that hinted at support, avenues I could exploit when the stakes were higher. My awareness heightened, a balance of cautious hope and deepened resolve, preparing for moments when I could assert control over my own narrative without creating spectacle. As the evening progressed, a toast was raised, and with it, the sharp sting of misattributed credit. A key effort of mine, something painstakingly arranged behind the scenes, was publicly credited to someone else. My jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the celebratory figure, while internally I cataloged the injustice, repressing the immediate urge to interject. Every word, every accolade they received felt like a personal slight, and I let it roll through me, transforming humiliation into quiet, strategic thinking. I noted the potential moments where my contributions could be revealed or leveraged, considering timing, audience perception, and the careful calibration of social dynamics. My plan began to crystallize. I mapped the room in my mind, noting who could be persuaded, who could observe without bias, and who might unintentionally tip the balance in my favor. Social leverage, private conversations, subtle positioning. These were my tools. My resolve hardened, anger tempered with caution, eyes constantly scanning for the moment when I could reclaim agency. I imagined stepping forward, not with dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet authority of someone who had prepared meticulously, who knew the truth, and was ready to assert it at the precise moment. The energy of the room shifted as influential guests gravitated toward the stage, signaling a tipping point. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against me, anticipation rising with each measured step of the approaching key figures. I held my composure, every muscle alert, every thought aligned toward action when it became necessary. Fear of further humiliation was tempered by a controlled determination. I would not be sidelined this evening. The subtle machinations, whispered intrigues, and misdirected praise had all built toward this moment, and I was ready to navigate it with calculated poise, prepared to claim the recognition and influence that had been denied for too long. The after-party lounge was dimly lit, shadows curling along the walls as guests murmured in hushed tones. I found a corner, leaning lightly against the polished railing of the terrace balcony, and let my eyes sweep over the room. Every detail of the night came rushing back, the misattributed credits, the subtle dismissals, the faint smirks that had followed my steps. I cataloged them mentally, noting which guests could be allies, who had been complicit, and who might yet be swayed. Frustration churned beneath the surface, but I kept it contained, letting it fuel careful observation rather than reckless reaction. Every glance, every laugh, every whispered aside was logged, forming a map of opportunity for when the time came to reclaim what had been denied. In a brief conversation near the drink station, I overheard a narrative twisting the events in favor of another. My role, the late hours, and careful planning I had invested were all erased from the story. The sting of humiliation pricked sharply, but I did not betray my anger. Instead, I watched closely, noting body language, who leaned in, who cast secretive looks, who might have sown these distortions. The room moved in rhythms I had come to anticipate. The mingling, the clinking of glasses, the subtle nods and smiles, but beneath it, currents of misinformation and quiet power struggles rippled, and I felt the acute need to navigate them with strategy, not impulse. As I traced the interactions, I identified vulnerabilities in the social network that had so often dictated my invisibility. Timing became crucial. There were moments where a subtle intervention could shift perceptions without public confrontation. I assessed who could be turned into allies, who posed risk, and where leverage might lie. It was a balancing act, too direct and the backlash could be severe, too timid and the evening's injustices would solidify. I absorbed the atmosphere, calibrating each thought, each intended move with precision, careful to maintain outward composure while the mind raced through potential scenarios. Then came the shock. A guest I had trusted, someone whose presence had always felt like a buffer against the evening's slights, aligned themselves quietly with the opposing side. The misinformation I had detected earlier gained weight, reinforced by this betrayal. The isolation hit sharply, yet I allowed it to sharpen rather than unhinge me. I recalibrated, reassessing strategies, mapping contingencies. There was no room for impulse, only methodical preparation, preserving options while maintaining an aura of calm. I noted each slight glance, each faint shift in posture, and translated them into an internal plan of subtle countermeasures. With renewed clarity, I plotted my course. I would assert my presence carefully, reclaim acknowledgement, and influence perception without overtly confronting the perpetrators. Each gesture, each word, had potential weight. Each private conversation could tip the scales. I prepared the right timing, visualized the execution of subtle reveals that could restore balance in my favor. Anger became a tool, focus sharpened, every movement intentional, each observation contributing to the endgame I was quietly orchestrating. The room began to shift as attention subtly gravitated toward a central figure. I sensed the moment approaching, the pivotal point where strategy would be tested. Eyes flicked, murmurs rose and fell, and my pulse aligned with the cadence of the room. I braced myself, controlled anticipation tightening every nerve, knowing the culmination of tonight's interplay was about to unfold. I would not be sidelined. I would maneuver with precision, reclaiming presence and influence quietly but unmistakably. Every calculated step, every measured word was part of the plan forged through frustration, observation, and the drive to confront shadows that had lingered far too long. The rooftop terrace was quieter than the rest of the party, the city lights twinkling below as the evening deepened. I leaned against the railing, letting the hum of distant conversations filter through, and reviewed every slight, every misattributed acknowledgement, every whispered distortion that had accumulated over the night. My mind worked like a ledger, cataloging offenses and analyzing patterns, carefully noting who had undermined me, who had claimed credit for work that was mine, and who might still be swayed to support me. Anger simmered, but it was precise, a controlled heat that sharpened my focus rather than clouded judgment. Every guess became a data point, every glance a clue, every pause in conversation a potential pivot point for my actions to come. Then it happened. A casual comment, barely audible but weighted, aimed to diminish my contributions in front of several influential attendees. The sting was immediate, a flash of humiliation that threatened to flare outward, but I kept my expression neutral, my mind already calculating who had whispered it, who would repeat it. How would it ripple through the network of alliances I had been mapping all night? I noted every body language cue, every micro-reaction, and began drafting subtle strategies to reclaim control without drawing overt attention to myself. The room itself seemed to bend with the shifting social currents, and I moved mentally within it, placing pieces on an invisible board. Careful planning followed. I identified the right moments, the right gestures, the right words that could assert my presence and reclaim the narrative quietly but unmistakably. Each conversation, each casual interaction became an opportunity to demonstrate expertise, to signal competence, to reclaim visibility without appearing confrontational. I studied the pacing of interactions, the ebbs and flows of attention, timing my interventions to maximize impact. Subtle nods, well-timed questions, references to prior accomplishments, all became instruments in a silent symphony of reclamation. The terrace, with its scattered groups and pockets of privacy, provided vantage points from which to execute these moves with discretion. A first counteraction presented itself when I slipped a small artifact into a casual discussion, a document, an object, a fact, something tangible that reminded those present of my role in orchestrating earlier successes. The effect was almost imperceptible, yet internally, it was satisfying. Eyes lingered, questions were asked, small acknowledgments surfaced. I signaled to my few discreet allies that the narrative was beginning to shift, that steps were being taken to restore the truth without triggering open conflict. Tentative pride mixed with cautious triumph, the momentum of the night was subtly tilting in my favor. Even as I acted, I kept one eye on the larger picture. The terrace led to the garden, to hallways that connected to the main party, each path a corridor of potential observation, opportunity, or risk. I visualized the next moves, anticipated possible counteractions, and adjusted strategies accordingly. Determination solidified into vigilance. Every moment was measured, every gesture calculated as I prepared for the more decisive interventions to come. The city lights shimmered below, a mirror to the tension above, and I felt the power of quiet resolve settle firmly within me. The night was far from over. Across the terrace, key figures began to drift toward the spaces where influence would soon be exercised, groups forming, attention shifting, the air taut with anticipation. I took a deep breath, centered myself, and prepared for the moment when subtlety would give way to decisive assertion. Patience, strategy, and awareness had brought me here. Now it was time to stand firmly to ensure that my contributions, my intelligence, and my presence would no longer be ignored or diminished. The first moves had been made. The next would define the evening. The city lights stretched out below the rooftop lounge, a glittering expanse that seemed almost indifferent to the battles playing out above it. I traced every move, every whispered comment, every glance that had passed unnoticed in earlier moments, and realized that my incremental interventions, while effective in small ways, had not shifted the balance as much as I had hoped. Frustration prickled along my skin, but it sharpened my clarity. I began to map the decisive steps needed, not impulsive reactions, but deliberate, calculated moves designed to reclaim authority and assert the credibility I had long earned. My mind ran through the layout of the room, noting who could influence perception, who could be leveraged, and who might resist. Allies were positioned in subtle yet pivotal spots, ready to reinforce any small victories I could engineer. Calm composure became my armor, and every thought of confrontation was measured and precise. Then, an unexpected obstacle arose. A report had circulated, subtle but potent, misrepresenting my influence in front of key stakeholders. I caught it before it fully spread, yet the sting of surprise demanded immediate recalibration. My heart rate quickened, and my mind analyzed the potential fallout. Who had initiated it, and why? Which relationships were vulnerable to this new undermining? I kept my expression neutral while internally recalculating the sequence of moves necessary to regain control. The tension coiled in the room, almost tangible, and I felt the pressure of countering this maneuver while preserving my larger strategy. Every gesture, every pause, every minor interaction now carried amplified weight. I had to be precise, no mistakes, no impulsive reactions. I took a moment to gather my strength, reviewing the alliances I could rely on. Small conversations reinforced the loyalty of those who had quietly supported me, while I monitored others for cracks in their composure, ready to exploit any misstep. I rehearsed interventions in my mind. The right phrasing, the precise timing, the controlled reveal of facts that had been previously ignored or misattributed, documentation, artifacts, subtle reminders of past contributions, all were mentally cataloged and prepared for strategic deployment. Confidence returned, tempered by caution, and I felt a renewed sense of agency. The opposition's movements were scrutinized, their errors noted, their vulnerabilities assessed, and my resolve solidified in anticipation of turning the tide. The first major reversal came when I executed a subtle yet impactful maneuver. A carefully timed disclosure, a document, a photograph, a reference, was introduced into conversation at just the right moment. The reaction was immediate, a flicker of recognition in eyes that had previously ignored my efforts. Whispers shifted, conversations diverted toward what had been overlooked. Pride mingled with anxiety as I watched the subtle recalibration of perception unfold. Allies responded with discreet acknowledgement, reinforcing the quiet shift in narrative control. The hierarchy, once skewed, tilted perceptibly. For the first time that evening, I felt the power of deliberate action translating into tangible influence. With that step behind me, I turned my attention to the larger confrontation looming on the horizon. The stage was being set, both literally and figuratively, for more decisive action in the coming moments. Timing, sequencing, and environmental leverage were meticulously plotted. Every potential move, every possible reaction was considered, and my internal narrative consolidated into a steady pulse of focus. I was determined, vigilant, aware that patience combined with precise execution would yield the results long overdue. The rooftop terrace, the adjoining lounges, even the private balcony, all became arenas for careful observation and controlled assertion. My mind and body aligned, ready to act without hesitation, poised to transform the subtle shifts of influence into undeniable presence. The evening's energy thickened as I noticed key players moving into positions that would dictate the flow of events. Each step they took signaled the alignment of interests, the anticipation of confrontation, and the subtle orchestration of social forces. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. The night had reached a critical juncture, the moment where careful strategy, patience, and foresight could finally converge to create an irreversible shift. Every choice I had made, every minor victory, every cautious intervention had led to this point. I watched them assemble, fully aware that the decisive moment was nearly upon me, and for the first time, I felt the balance tilting unmistakably in my favor. The stage was set, and the night's true turning point was about to unfold. The night air on the rooftop terrace felt charged, every shadow and flicker of light magnifying the tension that had been building for weeks. I had reviewed every note, every conversation, every subtle slight and misattribution, cataloging each as evidence, each as a stepping stone to reclaim what had long been ignored. Allies were positioned strategically, silent but attentive, ready to validate truth without drawing unnecessary attention. I rehearsed every exchange in my mind, anticipating the opposition's moves while keeping my composure sharp, like a blade honed for a decisive strike. Each heartbeat seemed to echo the inevitability of the confrontation, and my focus sharpened with the clarity that only comes when patience meets preparation. There would be no hesitation, no misstep, only calculated precision to expose what had long been concealed. The first shift came as subtle murmurs revealed hidden betrayals. Documents, once concealed or misrepresented, surfaced before decision-makers and influential onlookers. Shock rippled across the room, but I kept my face neutral, noting how the dynamics shifted even with this minor exposure. Allies' eyes flickered with recognition, validation of my contributions that had long been overshadowed. The opposition faltered briefly, uncertainty creeping into their expressions as the balance began to tip. I internalized each reaction, adjusting my mental strategy, ready to escalate with controlled precision. The empowerment that came with revealing concealed truths was intoxicating, yet tempered by the careful awareness that the evening was far from over. With momentum gathering, I asserted my presence. Carefully timed words, supported by evidence and subtle gestures, reinforced the authority and credibility I had earned. My voice was calm but unmistakable, articulating points that left little room for doubt. Allies reinforced my narrative, offering corroboration without overt fanfare, while those who had sought to obscure my efforts paused, their confidence shaken. The energy shifted, the room subtly aligned with the reality I had meticulously constructed. Tension crackled as the opposition attempted to recalibrate, yet each move they made only confirmed the effectiveness of my strategy. The stakes were high, but the controlled assertiveness radiated a quiet power that commanded attention without aggression. Then came the opposition's desperate counterattack, a sudden maneuver designed to discredit, a last-minute attempt to reclaim dominance through misinformation or strategic misrepresentation. The room seemed to tighten around the unfolding drama. I met it with measured composure, observing, adapting, and responding in real time. Each move was countered with pre-planned subtlety, turning their aggression into proof of their instability and highlighting the contrast between their desperation and my calculated resolve. The allies who had been quietly supportive now became crucial in reinforcing the transparency and integrity of my actions. Every gesture, every word was deliberate, reaffirming my authority while preserving poise under scrutiny. The climax approached with almost cinematic inevitability. All pieces, evidence, allies, timing, and environmental leverage had aligned. The opposition was visibly constrained, unable to mount a coherent response, while I maintained the rhythm of strategic assertion. Each subtle revelation, each calibrated interaction, had built to this pinnacle moment where truth would speak clearly and indisputably. The room was silent in anticipation, every gaze tethered to the shifting balance of power. I felt a controlled excitement, the kind born from meticulous planning and the certainty that justice, long deferred, was now within reach. The final act of confrontation was imminent, and tomorrow the truth would finally speak for itself. The room was quiet, tension finally giving way to the weight of resolution. I stepped forward with the evidence that had been meticulously compiled over months. Each document, each note, each recorded exchange now lining up like a sequence of undeniable truth. Allies quietly reinforced my points, offering corroboration at the precise moments that solidified the narrative. The opposition, confronted with both the facts and the gaze of impartial witnesses, had no room to maneuver. I felt a rare sense of triumph wash over me, a balance of relief, validation, and empowerment as credibility was restored. The confrontation, long anticipated and carefully strategized, unfolded smoothly, leaving no ambiguity about the reality of my contributions and the deceptions that had obscured them. Observing the reactions around me, I realized the culmination of every subtle plan, every patient observation, had reached fruition. Once the immediate tension dissipated, I allowed myself to step back, breathing in the calm that followed the storm. I reflected on the journey, the frustration, the indignation, the silent calculations that had shaped each move. There was a quiet gratitude for resilience earned, for lessons learned in patience, vigilance, and the assertion of self-worth. Reconnecting with those allies who had been steadfast and even repairing fractured family interactions, I felt a sense of closure settle over me. Trust and recognition had been restored, and while challenges would persist, there was a newfound clarity about what I could endure and what I would no longer tolerate. The words of an old mentor echoed in my mind, reminding me that integrity and patience are the ultimate instruments of change. The recurring symbol from earlier chapters, the small keepsake, a token once associated with hurt and invisibility, found new meaning. In my hands now, it was a marker of evolution, a tangible reminder of lessons assimilated and battles overcome. Where once it had represented exclusion and humiliation, it now resonated with personal growth, empowerment, and the subtle triumph of strategy and foresight. The contrast was stark and poignant, reinforcing the narrative arc that had carried me from betrayal to recognition, from restraint to quiet dominance. Each glance at it reminded me of both the struggle endured and the calm certainty of the resolution I had achieved. As the evening drew to a close, the city lights twinkled beyond the windows, a soft backdrop to the internal peace I felt. The opposition had faced natural consequences. The network of allies stood strong, and my personal and professional space had been reclaimed with dignity. Life moved on, yet the lessons remained, etched into memory, informing future decisions, guiding measured action, and reinforcing the strength built from perseverance. Some battles end, but the lessons linger. I stood, looking out across the skyline, the quiet satisfaction of justice paired with the curiosity of what lay ahead. The city sleeps, but my resolve is wide awake.